Hello and welcome to First Luke, a weekly Bible study looking ahead to the readings for the coming Sunday. My name's Carl and it's great to have you with us today. In this Bible study we're going to be exploring Matthew 25 verses 14 to 30, which is Jesus telling the parable of the talents. Before we get started, if you've not done so already, you might like to download the sheet that accompanies this Bible study. You'll find the link for that just below the video in YouTube. It's got the passage, it's got the questions that we're going to be looking at together, and it's got space for you to jot down your thoughts as we go through. So without further ado, let's dive into this passage. We're in the story of Holy Week, and Jesus is with his disciples on the Mount of Olives, and he is teaching them. We're in a block of teaching that encompasses possibly Matthew 23, but certainly chapters 24 and 25. The focus is very much on warnings and looking ahead to what the coming kingdom of God will be like. And in chapter 25, we've got 3 extended parables. So in last week's Bible study, we looked at verses 1 to 13 and the parable of the oil lamps, or sometimes called the parable of the foolish virgins. And next week, we will finish off our looking through Matthew's Gospel for a season with the parable of the sheep and the goats in verses 31 to 46. So this week, we have the parable of the talents. So this is one of the 5 blocks of teaching that Jesus shares with his disciples and others throughout Matthew's Gospel. And so it's very much geared towards thinking about what the kingdom of God is going to be like. There is a very similar, in some ways and different in others, story in Luke chapter 19 verses 11 to 27, that if anything is actually a more violent version of this story than the one in Matthew, but which picks up on similar themes. And it appears that the key quote here in verse 29 that Matthew uses comes from Mark's Gospel, specifically chapter 4 verses 24 to 25. So it's bringing in this idea of, to those that have things in abundance, more will be given, and to those that have little, what they have will be taken away from them. So let's dive into the text itself. The first thing that's really important to note is the word talent. The Greek word talanton means a silver coin that was incredibly valuable. It was worth about what an ordinary labourer could expect to earn in 15 years. It doesn't have the modern connotations of being about an individual's skills and gifts and abilities. It's come to mean that, but it's not part of its original meaning. So when you come across sermons that basically put forward a view of the parable of the talents as being about not wasting our God-given gifts and skills, yes, that's a really good message, but it's not what this parable is getting at. It's likely that the master in this story represents some kind of wealthy business figure who regularly went away on long journeys. And the funds that are handed out to the different servants are based on their proven abilities from previous occasions. So one of them gets 5 talents, 1 2, and the other 1. So if a talent is equivalent to, let's say, about £250,000 this year, I think that's not unreasonable. It gives you some idea of the sums of money that were involved. They were substantial. Different people understand the role of the third servant in particular, who really is the pivotal figure here, in different ways. So Craig Evans in his commentary refers to this servant as the timid servant, which is an interesting description. He's the one who, instead of going out and doubling the money, instead buries the talent, hides it away. Those who doubled their money were referred to as good and faithful servants. As we'll see later on, that was not the fate that befell the third servant. It was not an unusual thing to do in those days if you wanted to keep something safe, keep some valuables safe, to bury it. So if you think about, for example, the parable of the buried treasure or the parable of the pearl of great value, going back earlier a few chapters in Matthew's Gospel, You see characters there burying valuable things that they've found. And in a world without banks, it was the safest way to make sure that something valuable was tucked away, wouldn't be got at by anybody else. The third servant perhaps followed this course of action because he was afraid of the consequences if he lost what the master had entrusted him with. And he portrays his master as being both dishonest and harsh. It's likely, according to the commentators, that didn't so much mean the master was a thief, so much that he was a landlord who was really harsh, and if his tenants fell even slightly behind on their rental payments, he was not averse to seizing their crops and claiming them for his own. Now, when the third servant is confronted by the master, in verse 26, we see that the description that the third servant has offered of the master isn't actually seriously challenged. It seems the master accepts these things about himself. And when the master rebukes the servant for not investing the money in the bank and trying to get interest, it is worth noting that if you were a Jewish person, you could not collect interest from another Jew, according to the law of Moses. There were prohibitions against that in Exodus 22:25, Deuteronomy 23, verses 19 to 20, and indeed Leviticus 25:36-37. So it's very clear that it wasn't okay. You could collect interest from a Gentile, but not from a fellow Jew. And that ought to make alarm bells ring if we associate the master with God in this parable. Why would God be blatantly breaking the law of Moses in that way? What's going on? The crux of this parable, I would argue, comes in verse 29, in that condemnation that I say probably goes back to Mark's Gospel. Craig Evans, in his commentary, argues that this has been inserted into the text later on. But I think it says a lot about Matthew's mindset as a gospel writer. We could, as Tom Wright suggests, be looking at a parable which is aimed at the religious elites of Israel who were failing to live up to all that they were meant to be. They weren't shining out the light of God. Indeed, we could be talking about people in Matthew's own community who were failing to take the work of God seriously and also failing to shine out the light of God. But either way, I think if we assume that the master is the character that we should associate with God, then I think what we're looking at is very much the cultural assumptions from the Roman Empire that would have shaped Matthew's view being almost imposed by him upon the kingdom of God. So in other words, instead of the kingdom of God critiquing what the Roman Empire is like in Matthew's mind, it's more that Matthew looks at what's around him and assumes that God's kingdom is going to be like that. How often, friends, do we fall into those traps of looking at what's around us and assuming that God's economy, God's way of doing things, works in the same way? There is, however, another way of reading this. So the key assumption is that God is associated with the master. And very often we do think of the powerful figures, the kings and the masters and the lords and whatnot, as being like God. But what if actually it's this figure of the third servant who is more like God, or specifically more like Jesus? See, Barbara Reed in her commentary argues that Jesus in his time didn't live under the kind of capitalist system that we're so used to today. But actually, people lived under a system called limited good. And in that understanding, limited good, what it meant was that if you accumulated more wealth beyond what you needed just to survive day to day, then you were fundamentally taking that away from somebody else. So if you amass lots and lots and lots more money, then you were, in Barbara Reed's words, greedy and wicked. When we're talking about the kinds of sums that the person who accumulated another 5 talents had, or even the one who accumulated another 2, we're talking, therefore, if that way of reading it is correct, about a lot of exploitation, a lot of taking away from others. In her view, then, the third servant is more like Jesus because he was the one who refuses to play the game. He takes what we might now call non-violent direct action. He buries the master's treasure. He doesn't take it for himself. He doesn't steal it or squander it or allow it to be stolen. He gives the master back what is his, but without doing anything that enables the master to profit from wealth extracted from others harshly. It's interesting to keep in mind that in verse 30, when it talks about being cast out into the outer darkness where there would be weeping and gnashing of teeth, that's exactly what would happen to Jesus a couple of days after telling his disciples this parable. He was cast out of the city of Jerusalem to Golgotha, which was outside the city walls. And if ever there was a place of weeping or gnashing of teeth, it was there. So what this parable boils down to, friends, is who do you most associate with God and Jesus? The master or the third servant? As we explore our questions this week, that's one of the things that will come up. And we'll also be thinking about what it means to allow our light to shine out into the world.